Giving the finger to regulators. Uber, FlightNow, and the future of technological civil disobedience. Uber did a quintessentially Uber thing last week. With little warning, the company released its self-driving cars in San Francisco. In a brief blog post, the company announced that a small fleet of its autonomous vehicles were being deployed in the Bay Area. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise to anyone. Building on its successes in Pittsburgh, Uber is now bringing its technology home to California, where it plans to continue improving it through real-world operation. There's just one problem with Uber's announcement: almost everyone seems pissed about it. California regulators are mad that they were never consulted. The state's DMV argues that the company should have sought a permit first. In a letter to Uber, the DMV stated that the company must immediately shut down its autonomous vehicles and apply for a permit. If it doesn't, the agency warns, the DMV will initiate legal action, including, but not limited to, seeking injunctive relief. California AG Kamala Harris is threatening legal action too. But the California officials are not alone in their ire, and many other critics have voiced frustration with Uber's latest move. Some are also contemplating legal action of their own. Christopher Dolan, a San Francisco plaintiff's attorney, described this as just another example of Uber giving the finger to regulators and putting public safety at risk. And others seem just plain offended by Uber's unwillingness to ask for permission. Matthew DeBoard, writing at Business Insider, claims that Uber has reverted to its old, tried and true way of advancing its business, playing chicken with the regulations and laws of cities, states, and even entire countries. Unfortunately, all of this hand-wringing over Uber's unwillingness to play nice with regulators misses a critical fact: this is the reason why Uber has survived at all. Uber's growth, like the rest of the sharing economy, is a direct result of refusing to ask permission. Those who fail to grasp this falsely assume that Uber's existence has always been inevitable. Nothing could be further from the truth. What if Uber had asked for permission? Before getting into the issue of Uber's autonomous vehicles, it's important to remember where Uber has been coming from over the past 7 years. Almost every time the company expands into a new jurisdiction, its legality is challenged by local governments. If Uber would have asked for permission, the company would have been shut down without ever showing consumers how much better transportation could be. That's because much of the traditional regulatory framework is antithetical to the type of innovation that Uber is engaged in. My colleague Adam Thierer describes it like this. Most traditional regulatory systems are highly precautionary, preemptive, and prophylactic in character. They generally opt for policy solutions that are top-down, overly rigid, and bureaucratic. This results in a slow-moving and sometimes completely stagnant regulatory approval process that can stop innovation dead in its tracks, or at least delay it for many years. Such systems send innovators a clear message: you are guilty until proven innocent and must receive some bureaucrat's blessing before you can move forward. Expecting Uber to ask permission is essentially telling them that they shouldn't even bother trying to rethink how we approach transportation. They should just pack up and go home. Taxi regulators and public utility commissioners remained unwilling to adapt even as Uber was radically changing the world around them. Why would they have suddenly accepted Uber simply because Uber asked them first? If you want to understand how regulators would have responded to a request from a disruptive innovator like Uber, there is a perfect example playing out now. FlightNow, Uber for airplanes, asked for permission. Now they are fighting for the right to survive. A little background on FlightNow: the company provided a platform to connect private pilots with passengers to share flights in exchange for flight expenses, fuel, fees, etc. This practice that is not new in American aviation, and has been accepted by the FAA as legitimate for some time. However, because FlightNow was an online platform, it was slightly different from existing cost-sharing arrangements typically carried out via email, phone, and airport bulletin boards. In an attempt to clear up the ambiguity of how this arrangement fit into the FAA's rules, FlightNow asked for clarification. Several months later, the FAA responded by banning the practice. FlightNow is now shut down, and asking the Supreme Court to intervene. Uber exists, and FlightNow doesn't, because Uber was willing to engage in a level of technological civil disobedience that FlightNow wasn't. FlightNow could have continued to allow pilots and passengers to connect, leverage the legal ambiguity its own favor, and put the onus on the FAA to shut them down. This is the Uber approach to innovation. Instead of pursuing this route, however, FlightNow chose to ask the FAA. It got the clarity it was looking for, but not the permission it sought. Now imagine Uber taking this approach. Which jurisdiction would have said yes when Uber asked for permission? Most of the reform efforts that were undertaken after Uber arrived were done precisely because Uber wasn't going to leave. Policymakers were under pressure from constituents that had now become avid Uber customers. Would we have seen this same push for reform in ride-sharing over the last 2 years if it concerned a company that sat idly by waiting for permission? Absolutely not. Flight sharing, again, is the perfect example here. With no major constituency pushing for reform, policymakers have little incentive to rush to allow this disruptive innovation into the market. FlightNow, for better or worse, is our best guess at what Uber and the entire sharing economy would look like without the technological civil disobedience that spurred its growth. The failure of consumer protection regulation. This growth hasn't been limited to companies, which have enjoyed billion-dollar valuations. It has also brought huge benefits to consumers. All of these improvements have been a direct result of the fact that Uber, and companies like it, refuse to comply with laws. This shouldn't be ignored. Look, for example, at pre-Uber taxi regulations. It's no longer controversial to say that consumer protection laws in transportation have failed to deliver. Perhaps it has never been controversial. Pre-Uber taxis weren't exactly a paragon of customer service, and had been that way for decades. Over the last 80 years, as taxi failed to improve, nothing changed. That's because these well-intentioned public interest regulations often serve industry interests rather than consumer interests. As I've noted in research with Adam Thierer and Matthew Mitchell. By limiting entry, or by raising rivals' costs, regulations can be useful to the regulated firms. Though regulations often make consumers worse off, they are often sustained by political pressure from consumer advocates because they can be disguised as consumer protection. As a result, there is little incentive for regulators to improve. What, then, triggered reform? Uber. Refusing to comply was about more than profiting from ambiguity and arbitrage. Instead, it has forced regulators and lawmakers to get better by highlighting just how poorly the regulated system worked. Using controversy as one of its strongest tools for reform, Uber has put us on notice that a better alternative exists. And it's worked extremely well. Since Uber has arrived, policymakers across the country have been forced to reform. Most of Florida has deregulated transportation, Nevada is beginning to disband its taxi regulator, and nearly every state has passed, or proposed, legislation to allow ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft to operate. None of this would have happened if Uber accepted the claim that they were a taxicab company, and simply complied. It's not about the permit. Turning back to Uber's autonomous vehicles, the same situation seems to be playing itself out again. The entire point here isn't that Uber simply refuses to apply for a permit. Instead, this is about bigger, broader reforms in California. As Anthony Lewandowski, head of Uber's Advanced Technology Group, wrote in his blog post announcing San Francisco's self-driving fleet. But there is a more fundamental point: how and when companies should be able to engineer and operate self-driving technology. We have seen different approaches to this question. Most states see the potential benefits, especially when it comes to road safety. And several cities and states have recognized that complex rules and requirements could have the unintended consequence of slowing innovation. Pittsburgh, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida in particular have been leaders in this way, and by doing so have made clear that they are pro-technology. Our hope is that California, our home state and a leader in much of the world's dynamism, will take a similar view. Uber could have applied for the permit and moved on. However, this would have only enabled the company to use its autonomous vehicles under rather restrictive regulations. Much like Uber's efforts to dismantle antiquated taxi laws, the point here is to fix the underlying legal framework for autonomous vehicles in California. This isn't a matter of simply refusing to comply. It's a matter pushing California to reform in a very direct, public way. Yes, Uber is giving the finger to regulators. But we shouldn't think of this as childish by any means. On the contrary, Uber might be one of the few adults in the room, forcing lawmakers to grow up and face the reality that the world is quickly changing around them.